Okay, now let's talk about speaking part 2. The first thing we're going to discuss is the difference in the format. Because while you were given about 15 to 30 seconds to answer each of the questions in speaking part 1, here the examiner will tell you that you will have 1 minute to prepare a talk which is going to last from 1 to 2 minutes. They will say that you can make some notes if you wish, and not to worry if they stop you. So, if you want to score as highly as possible on fluency and coherence, you want to talk for the full 2 minute stretch. Secondly, you don't have to take notes with the pencil and paper, but you can, and it's a skill on its own. Now, lastly, you are going to be assessed against all those 4 criteria that we have just covered. And in a minute, we will listen to someone who will answer and discuss their strong points and weaknesses. Now, first of all, let's look at the task. A typical task looks like this. Describe a rural town that you plan to visit in the future. You should say where the town is, when you would like to go, who you would go with, and explain what you would like to do there. As I said, in a minute we're going to listen to someone who gives this answer, but even before you start planning your answer, as with essay questions, you have to identify what exactly is needed. Now, you want to notice the word where to talk about the geographical location of the town. You should notice that you want to talk about the rural town, a rural town that you plan to visit in the future and not visit it or live in. When you would like to go is the next point. Who you would go with is another thing to cover. Now, do you have to cover every single one? More or less, yes. But if you cover some of them in more detail, more in depth, that's fine. So don't worry about that too much. Also, you want to explain what you would like to do there. What you would like to do. So 4 things in total. But this is a very important point where the effect of grammar starts being noticeable. You might have noticed that there is lots of would verbs here. When you would like to go, who you would go with, explain why, what you would like to do there. Now, this is not something to ignore, because if you don't talk about your personal plans and preferences about this trip, you will not score very well on fluency and coherence. Imagine I'm going to talk about a town called, there is a nice town called Gatchina next to St. Petersburg, where I live. And I want to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about in the past, for example. So I said, yeah, the last time I visited Gatchina, it was nice. It's situated in the northwest, and it's full of fantastic activities. You can really let your hair down there and have a nice outing with your friends and family. Now, did I use good vocabulary? Probably. I used an idiom there and my grammar was correct, but did I fulfill the task? No, because I talked about the trip in the past. What if I talked about someone else who is going to visit this town. Again, I would not fulfill the fluency and coherence criterion because the task clearly states you plan to visit in the future. Something that you would like to do there. So please pay attention in speaking part 2 to the tenses in the task. And keep in mind that your tenses should be, if not the same, they should fulfill the same function. So instead of would, repeating would, you could say, it might be nice to go for a stroll along the lake. Or I'm going to visit my family, or something like it could be a good idea to bring some souvenirs. So although I'm not repeating would all the time, I am fulfilling the same function. And functions are extremely important. We will talk about functions, grammatical functions, a bit later when we cover speaking part 3. So without further ado, let me play the recording. And while you're listening, I'd like you to tell me how this person, the guy who talks, is going to fare when it comes to the 4 criteria. Let me move them a little bit. So, whether he does well when it comes to the criteria and whether he covers all of the points. All right? Let me play the recording.
Track 7.
So, I'm going to tell you about a town in the Lake District, which is a beautiful region in the northwest of England, pretty close to the border of Scotland. There are dozens of fantastic little villages and towns there, but the one that tops the rest is called Windermere. It sits on a huge lake and is surrounded by hills, trees, and rocks. I've been lots of times already, and I can't wait to go back. As soon as I finish the second semester at university, I'm going to head up there again. Being far up in the north, as you can imagine, it can get pretty cold in Windermere, particularly in winter. Too cold for some. Having said that, there's a real stark beauty to the town at that time. When your breath comes out like mist and the streets get white with the snow that falls. Summer is the opposite extreme. It can actually get pretty warm. Comfortable enough to wear just a t-shirt and shorts, but if you wanted to visit at that time, you'd have to get yourself prepared for all the tourists. Other times, autumn is pretty, I've been told, but I tend to visit in spring. I go every year. Just me. I have to say that I generally prefer not to go with anyone else. For one thing, you can make friends really easily if you stay in a hostel. There are young people from all over the world who make it their mission to spend a few days or a week there. As I say, it's an ideal place to go hiking or hill walking, so that's the priority for me and for hundreds of others. There's also a really interesting variety of independent local shops, selling everything from cheap souvenirs to galleries full of extremely expensive art. When I go back, I'm going to do what I always do. Browse through the shops after a long day walking in the countryside.
So, what do you think? Do you remember the questions I asked you to think about? Well, the first question was whether the person covered all 4 points. And the answer is yes. However, he did not spend too much developing the third point, who he would go with. He just briefly mentioned that he prefers to go alone for a couple of reasons. Is this fine? Absolutely. He did spend a lot of time developing the other 3 points, and this is not going to affect his score in any negative way. If anything, it will help him achieve a high score for fluency and coherence. Let's see why. So, did he speak at length? Absolutely. He spoke for 2 minutes, taking up all of the time available to him. He hesitated a little bit and never corrected himself, avoided a lot of repetition. So this is also going to be a huge advantage. But what I'd like to, let me turn on the video. Yeah. So what I'd like to concentrate in more detail here when it comes to his answer is his use of connectives and discourse markers. I'd like to do that because a lot of the students, in my experience, get a bit lost, and they don't see the difference between connectives and discourse markers. So here I have the script of the audio, and let me just read what discourse markers he used. Discourse markers, as I said, are phrases that help make a conversation out of the monologue, first of all, and secondly, if it's a monologue, they make it structured. They help the listener to follow your flow of your speech. They help the listener to structurize what you're talking about. So let me illustrate. So for example, he starts with, I'm going to tell you about. Doesn't it just automatically grab your attention? Being far up the north, he says, as you can imagine. Do you feel just how it pulls you as a listener into the context? As you can imagine, it can get pretty cold. Very nice. Having said that, he says, there is a real stark beauty, blah, blah, blah. So this, having said that, shows us as listeners that he's going to introduce a contrasting point. Other times, autumn is pretty, I've been told, etc. Other times means he's going to move on to a next point. And he says, I've been told autumn is pretty, because he doesn't know. And we can guess from these words that he doesn't know. Other people have told them. I have to say that, for one thing, as I say, these are all phrases that can be called discourse markers, and they play an enormous role in faring high on fluency and coherence. Now, when it comes to lexical resource, he does use a lot of less common vocabulary, although not very much idioms and idiomatic language. But let me just give you a couple of examples. So he says, Windermere sits on a huge lake. Isn't it fantastic? It sits on a huge lake. It's not located, it's not situated. That's far too concrete. That's far too straightforward. No, it sits. Fantastic option. Instead of saying, I can't wait to go, instead of saying, I want to go back, he says, I can't wait to go back. Instead of saying, I'm going to go there, he says, I'm going to head up there. Stark beauty. Fantastic collocation. Not just beautiful, it's beautiful. Okay, but it has stark beauty to it. It's just great. Opposite extreme. Everything from cheap souvenirs to extremely expensive art. Browsing through the shops instead of going shopping. All of this will help him get a band 7 in lexical resource. So without looking very carefully at grammar range and pronunciation, I can tell you that this is a very good answer. I would not hesitate to give it a 7, provided, of course, he performs just as well in speaking part 3. So, as an assignment, I'm going to ask you to do this speaking part 2 task. I'd like you to give me a 2-minute talk answering this cue card, doing a 2-minute talk about a rural town that you plan to visit. Have a pen and a piece of paper ready. Give yourself 1 minute to prepare and then give yourself 2 minutes. I will do my best to evaluate your answers, posted on Flipgrid. And as I said before, you are more than welcome to assess other students speaking. If you're not comfortable with posting your own assessment in plain view for everyone to see, you're free to send them to me privately. This is fine. And as I said, we're going to look at part 3, not in this session, but in the next one, because it's pretty lengthy, it's pretty complex. So let's just concentrate on speaking part 1 and 2. That's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I can't wait to see your speaking answers. Have a great week.